Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me for this segment, we have Mark Marex, Senior Director of Index Research and Development with Nasdaq Investment Intelligence. He joins me to discuss the recent turnaround in Nasdaq Biotech performance. Mark, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Trade Talks, and that really has been a key theme, how we're seeing the shift into healthcare. Let's talk about the Nasdaq Biotech Index, its performance, and relative to its bench.
Sure, Jill. Thanks for having me. Yeah, biotech has been one of the few areas of the market that's been sort of stuck in this really long-term underperformance trend since kind of early 2021, I would peg it at. So if you see here on this first chart, I've got last three full years, 2021 through 2023. Nasdaq Biotech is NBI, that's in the light green. We approached the drawdown of about 30% a couple times during the sort of generally negative market environment of 2022, but have really kind of struggled to recover most of that recently since sort of 4Q of 23. We've had a nice little upswing there, and that has somewhat continued this year. We're up about 2% year to date. But what I really want to point out to you here is some of the other lines on this chart. You've got the Nasdaq 100 in the purple there, really outperforming biotech, and then the S&P 500 in the gray. Big delta, right, between what the broader market's been doing the last couple of years in biotech. But check out the blue line at the very bottom of that chart, still down 36% over those last 3 years. That's the S&P Biotech Select Industry Index. And you may be asking yourself, well, why would two different indexes that track biotech have such diverging performance to the tune of almost 30 percentage points? It all goes back to a simple thing. It's weighting. Our index uses market cap weighting, which I think is much more appropriate for an industry that really has been around for a while now. The first biotech companies went public in the early 80s. Kind of makes sense to me to use market cap weighted for that type of industry where most of the performance is going to be driven by your biggest companies. The S&P index, however, uses a modified equal weight. So you get a lot more volatility in your performance, and you're subject to those sharper drawdowns as well if the smaller cap segment of biotech underperforms, which is exactly what's been happening.
Right. And what if we take a look at attribution in terms of how the Nasdaq Biotech Index has performed?
Yeah, so this is the kind of visual way of showing you all the constituents that have come through this index over the last 3 years. There's about 450 of them in total. What happens if you plot the sort of running return contribution all the way from your best performers, your best contributors, all the way to the very end? So you'll see in this chart, I've tried to code it intuitively to say, look, you're green. That's your top performers, your top 10 contributors to return for the index. They contributed a net 21% positive return to this index over the last 3 years, even though it was down around 6-7% over that time. Average index weight for these 10 companies, 4.5% each. So that gives you about 45%, almost half of the aggregate index weight. Again, the top 10, mostly the biggest names in the index, they've been doing okay. Then you look at the yellow section, that's sort of the next 100 positive contributors all the way to the most marginal. They're much smaller on average, only about 20 basis points average index weight, 19% in aggregate. They also contributed 11% return. Then you look at this really long red tail. That's the 335 names that had some sort of a negative contribution to the index return. Only 0.1% average index weight, 10 basis point average index weight for those, 36% of the aggregate index weight in total. That's where all your negative performance is coming from. These are disproportionately all of the smaller names for the most part in the index, maybe a couple of the larger names also on.
And Mark, I think the best way that we can visualize this is on the last chart that you have here, where you could see the difference in terms of small cap exposure and the volatility risk that carries. You can certainly see how that plays out in this last chart.
Yeah, Jill, this shows it pretty clearly, doesn't it? So I've broken the two indexes out here, the Nasdaq Biotech Index versus the S&P Biotech. into these 5 market cap buckets, right? All the constituents in both indexes, where do their market caps fall into? And you can see the biggest difference here is the purple shading. So there's 100 companies in the Nasdaq Biotech Index that are in the purple, the 1 to 5 billion market cap spectrum. So kind of like in that lower mid cap tier, and some larger small caps as well. That's only 21% of your index weight in the Nasdaq Biotech. The smallest companies, sub 1 billion, there's 79 of them. That's another 4% of index weight. So together, you could say the small cap exposure and the smaller mid cap exposure is about a quarter of the Nasdaq Biotech. Look at the S&P. The purple is your biggest by far, 54% of the index weight coming from those 71 constituents that they have in the 1 to 5 billion market cap range, and then another 6% coming from sub 1 billion. So together, 60% of the index weight really coming from that small and sort of smaller mid cap segment. That's the whole ball game right there, pretty much. You can see that the greater than 50 billion, there's 5 companies in the S&P, there's 6 for the Nasdaq. We've got 37% of the index weight for those big, accomplished sort of long-term winners in the biotech space. The S&P index only has 6% of the index weight coming from that. So very, very different exposure, very different way of approaching index construction, and in terms of formulating a benchmark to track an industry. We really do think that market cap is the way to go for something that's been around as long as biotech, and with a lot of those established players in that greater than 50 billion market cap range.
All right, Mark, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.